anytime you want. Yeah.
Well, let's begin with a simple comparison. And the comparison is between the world that we see today and the world when life first emerged on the Earth. So today, we live in a world in which both the atmosphere and oceans are rich in oxygen, and that oxygen-rich environment supports a huge diversity of plants, animals, protozoa, algae, bacteria. That stands in real contrast to the beginnings of the Earth as a biological planet, because at that point you have only simple bacteria-like organisms, and they're living in a world that contains no oxygen. So if you think about it then, over the course of Earth history, two things are going to change. First, life is going to evolve from a small diversity of very simple organisms to the rich and varied diversity we see today. And at the same time, the environment is going to change from a world without oxygen to a world in which the atmosphere and the ocean throughout its depths are perfused with oxygen. The interesting thing about this is that these are not two independent histories. They're actually closely intertwined. So the history of oxygen, for example, turns out to be a first-order control on the history of life. Because if you look across the diversity of organisms living today, some of them need a lot of oxygen, others need very little, others need none. And that reflects this environmental history. So the first question you might ask then is, how do we know that 3 billion years ago the Earth had no oxygen? We don't have samples of the atmosphere, so what kind of information can we draw from the rock record that will actually tell us the state of the atmosphere on the early Earth? And it turns out that this history, to a first approximation, is written in iron. Now, what do I mean by that? If you ask where the iron that's used in industry comes from, the great bulk of it is actually mined from sedimentary rocks laid down on the seafloor before about 2.4 billion years ago. These rocks are called banded iron formation, and they consist of, not surprisingly, bands of iron-rich layers and silica-rich layers. Silica is silicon dioxide, it's quartz, the material of window glass. Now, what's interesting about that rock is it cannot, in principle, form in today's oceans. Why not? Because for that kind of rock to form, you have to have a source for iron, which is either erosion from continents or introduction from hydrothermal ridges, and then that iron has to be able to be transported through the ocean to the site where it will precipitate. In today's oceans, which are rich in oxygen, as soon as iron hits oxygen, it precipitates as an iron oxide. Iron is essentially insoluble in today's oxygen-rich oceans. So if we're going to make that kind of sedimentary rock, we have to have an ocean which is basically oxygen-free. And that's what the iron formation is telling us. For the first billion years of the recorded rock record, the oceans are oxygen-free. What that also means is that for the first billion years of life, we have a biota that does not really use oxygen for any important biological process. Now, it turns out there are other lines of evidence that we can use to gauge when oxygen started coming into the atmosphere. They're all based on the chemistry of rocks that form at the Earth's surface, and they all pretty much tell the same story. So, for example, we can take fool's gold or iron pyrite, iron sulfide minerals. Those minerals are actually very sensitive to the presence of oxygen. And if you would put iron pyrite out on a shelf, really over a period of years, it would start to oxidize to iron oxides and sort of destroying the fool's gold itself. If we look at sediments laid down on the early Earth, we find that pyrite, fool's gold, was eroded from a source on the continents, traveled down through rivers, and was deposited in deltas without ever coming into contact with oxygen. And we know that because the sand grains in the deltas contain iron pyrite and other iron-sensitive minerals. Those minerals pretty much stop accumulating in these settings at about the same time iron formation disappears. Another line of evidence is we can actually look at the chemistry of alteration of rock surfaces exposed to the atmosphere, what's usually called weathering, and what, in a sense, gives rise to soils in today's world. And again, when we look at those, pretty much based on the way iron reacts in those settings, we can see that before 2.4 billion years ago, exposed rocks were in contact with an atmosphere that didn't contain any oxygen. After 2.4 billion years, they're exposed to After 2.4 billion years, they're exposed to air that contains oxygen. And there's about half a dozen lines of evidence, and all of them tell the same story. Before about 2.4 billion years ago, little if any oxygen in the atmosphere or oceans. After 2.4 billion years ago, oxygen at least in the atmosphere and surface ocean. So if we accept this history of the environments in which we have a long interval of Earth history without oxygen, which ends about 2.4 billion years ago, and introduces an interval of Earth history which is not really like today, but at least has some oxygen in the atmosphere and surface ocean, that should really lead us to ask at least two questions. One, how does this fit with the record of life? And two, why does this happen? Why, after a billion years of life without oxygen, do we have this transition that will forever change the planet? Well, let's answer the first question to begin with. We know from environments today, that local environments without oxygen, we can get a good sense of what kind of organisms could live there. And it's mostly very simple cells like bacteria and another very simple group called the archaea. And you can have photosynthesis, you can have respiration and other processes that don't generate oxygen and don't use oxygen. So for a billion years on the early Earth, we could have had cycling of carbon through the biosphere without the familiar players like plants and animals that we have today. And that world was very stable, and it really did give rise to the foundations of our modern biosphere. Then, when we add oxygen, other things become possible. It becomes possible to use oxygen in respiration, what all of us do even as we're having this discussion. It becomes possible to use oxygen to actually oxidize reduced chemicals, reduced gases like hydrogen or hydrogen sulfide. And there are a number of bacteria that actually gain energy from that process. So the minute we add oxygen to the system, all sorts of new metabolic and biochemical pathways become possible. And in fact, a whole new way of life becomes possible, and that's the eukaryotic cell. As you may know, there are three great branches on the tree of life. One of them is the eukaryotes, that is, organisms like ourselves whose cells have a membrane-bounded nucleus. And one thing that we believe was true of the last common ancestor of all living eukaryotes was that it got its energy from a little organelle called a mitochondrion. And the mitochondrion is actually versatile metabolically, but fundamentally mitochondria are able to use oxygen to respire organic matter and gain energy from that. So once we get oxygen, this whole new type of life becomes possible. But it isn't just that life is reacting to this change in the environments of the Earth. Life has an important role in making that shift, because there's only one process on this planet that we know of that's capable of producing oxygen at rates high enough to oxygenate the atmosphere and oceans. And that is so-called oxygenic photosynthesis. We tend to think of that as green plant photosynthesis. It's what the trees do outside, and the grass and algae and ponds in the ocean. And basically in this reaction, CO2 is reacted with water, and the products are sugar and oxygen gas. So without that process, we would never have been able to make the transition to an oxygen-rich Earth. Now, having said that, it isn't simply the presence of oxygenic photosynthesis, which, although we think of it as a process carried out by plants, originated in a particular group of bacteria called the cyanobacteria. Just as there are processes that put oxygen into the atmosphere and oceans, there are other processes that actually remove it. All sorts of physical processes where volcanic gases get oxidized, or minerals get oxidized during weathering, or organisms use oxygen in respiration. So the transition from the early Earth without oxygen to Earth's middle age, where we at least have a couple percent perhaps of today's inventory of oxygen in the biosphere, really comes about when the rates at which oxygen is produced by cyanobacteria exceed the rates at which oxygen is consumed by other physical and biological processes. And once that transition is made, we move to a new stable state of the Earth. Okay, now let's go back to this world as it started to exist around 2.4 to 2.3 billion years ago. We now have a little bit of oxygen in the surface waters and in the atmosphere. Large areas of the subsurface of the oceans are still oxygen-free. We have many different kinds of bacteria and archaea living in the oceans, and they've now been joined by single-celled eukaryotic organisms, simple protozoa and later algae. That world persists for a very long time. It's not a world in which you and I could have lived. If you and I had stepped out onto the planet as it existed at the end of the first great oxygen revolution, we still would have suffocated within minutes, because there simply wasn't enough oxygen in the atmosphere to support our biology. So when does the world transit again to a state that can support the biology of large active animals and other organisms that not only need oxygen, but need it in relatively large amounts? Well, it turns out that happens pretty late in the history of the planet, about 600 million years ago. So following the great oxygen revolution, as it's called, at 2.4 billion years ago, we have about 1.8 billion years of a state of the Earth in which there is a little bit of oxygen, but not much, lots of bacteria and archaea, a limited importance of eukaryotic cells, mostly single cells, and then about 600 million years ago, for reasons that are still under debate, the chemistry of sedimentary rocks suggests that oxygen goes up again. And it comes up probably not to exactly today's levels, but between 600 and 540 million years ago, oxygen accumulates to levels that pretty much ventilate the full ocean. That is, we now have oxygen through most of the water column in the ocean. And there's enough oxygen in the atmosphere and water to support large animals. Now, not surprisingly then, if we look at the fossil record, what we see is the first paleontological evidence of large animals, and in particular large animals that would need high levels of oxygen, occurs just in the wake of the oldest rocks that tell us that oxygen is accumulating. So just as in the first oxygen revolution, we saw there was this relationship between life and environmental change 600 million years ago, there is another coordinated change between life and environments. Oxygen goes up to levels that will support a new kind of biology, and soon thereafter we see large, metabolically demanding animals spreading through the oceans. So if we back up then and look across the entirety of Earth history, we see that this rise of oxygen from essentially an oxygen-free planet on the early Earth to the oxygen-rich planet we see today happens in fits and starts, with change concentrated around 2.4 billion years ago and about 600 million years ago. And when we look at the record of biology that goes from a few simple bacteria-like organisms to the 10 million or more species we see today, that also changes episodically and goes from a world with only bacteria and archaea to a world in which they are joined by single-celled eukaryotic organisms, to a world in which they in turn are joined by large animals and eventually plants. So what we see then is that the history of life and the history of Earth's surface environment are coordinated. It's what's called coevolution. Life through time has responded to changes in the environment, and the environment itself has changed as a consequence of evolutionary changes in life. And I think it's important to know that you cannot understand the history of life without thinking hard about the environmental context of that history, and you cannot understand the history of environments without understanding how biology is changing through time. Having looked at this overview of the large-scale history of our own planet, we might want to ask the final question, and that is, of the history we've just discussed, how much of that is likely to be generalizable to wherever we might find life, and how much might be a particular feature of our own planet? And I think some things that almost have to be general are that life emerges on planets with no oxygen. It's very difficult to imagine the chemistry by which life comes to be taking place if oxygen is abundant in environments when this chemistry is playing out. So that's the first thing. On the other hand, it's also hard to imagine large active organisms like ourselves existing without oxygen to use as a fuel in respiration. Turns out there really isn't another chemical compound that has the same properties as oxygen in terms of reaping large amounts of energy from the respiration of organic matter. And oxygen is a gas, so it can accumulate in the atmosphere. And it's been suggested by a number of people that if and when we find evidence of large complex life on other planets, they will make use of oxygen. So that then suggests that wherever life emerges, it is likely to follow a coevolutionary path with its planet, that as life starts to change the planet will actually shape the subsequent course of evolution. Will that lead to technological intelligence on other planets? We don't know. We're more confident that when life begins, it's simple like bacteria. On some planets, you may never have an accumulation of oxygen, and life would never get past, say, the stage it was at 2.4 billion years ago. On our own planet, it obviously did, and that's why we're here to talk about it. If we take this view of life and Earth, it gives us a new perspective on ourselves, I think. We're used to thinking of the world as composed of plants and animals, and that somehow the microorganisms, the bacteria, the archaea, are intercalated into our world. But the history of life tells us it's exactly the opposite, that the Earth was fundamentally shaped and is fundamentally sustained by the many metabolisms of bacteria and archaea, and it's us who are intercalated into their world, not the opposite. And just the one way you can think about it is if you count all the cells that are inside your body, about 90% of them are bacterial. You are actually a bacterial processing plant. There are hundreds of types of bacteria in your gut cavity. There are hundreds more in your mouth, on your skin. And it's not just that those are simple riders that are irrelevant to your existence. Neither are most of them pathogens. Very few of those bacteria are doing you harm. In fact, a much larger number of those bacteria are actually doing things that make your health possible. So gut bacteria not only process food and allow you to metabolize it, they actually train your immune system. They contribute signals for the development of your body. And really over the last decade, scientists have learned that the complex life of not just humans, but pretty much all animals really represents a very, very close symbiotic relationship between the conspicuous, which is us, and the numerous, which is the bacteria we live with.